Hello. I have recorded this particular PowerPoint presentation to help you understand my expectations for your essay in this class related to the works of literature we are reading in the class. It's called Writing About a Work of Literature Exegetically, a Brief Explanation. Um, you may or may not have heard the term exegetical or exegesis before, but this is an instruction on how best to approach a work with what is a very old, one might even say an ancient tradition of writing about books that matter to us in our society. So what does it mean to write an exegetical paper? That's what I've called your assignment. I've asked you to write exegetical essays for me in English 231. So what does that actually look like? Exegetical readings draw out meaning from a book by a process of query called exegesis. Now that may sound abstract, and I'm telling you not to panic. The truth is, there's a very good chance you understand this concept from previous experience in your life. But even if you don't, this is quickly discernible. Anyone who has ever been part of a Bible study, a Sunday school, anyone who studied the Torah, or even the Quran, understands this concept. If my book is holy, my book is the authority of what the book means. This is an idea about the Bible. This is an idea about the Torah. This is an idea about the Quran that are held by the people who worship in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. This concept, while we are reading works that are not holy, but they are books that have meaning, I would argue, are subject to this style of interpretation. Here's how it works if we're talking about a holy book. The book is the highest authority on what the book means. In other words, if I want to interpret the Bible, the best source of information I have is what the Bible says. It's not what a person who's living or dead, independent of the Bible, says. It's what the book itself says. This would be true for the way we read a book in this class. If I want to understand something Shakespeare said, I could read a lot that other people have said that about what Shakespeare means, and that's not bad. That may even be very helpful. But ultimately, if the words of Shakespeare don't square with what the person said Shakespeare said or meant, then I'm in an area where I probably don't have a correct interpretation. The book is the highest authority on what the book means, and readers weigh different portions of the book to arrive at a conclusion about its meaning. Here's what I mean. How do I understand the idea of one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill? That sounds pretty basic. And yet we see that there are times in the Bible where it is part of the Jewish law to kill people. And Jesus goes to the cross dying for us so that we would need not die if we are Christians. And so what does killing mean? In order for me to understand whether or not there is any permission to kill, thou shalt not kill seems not to have been an across the board commandment against it. Some Christians do see it that way. Some people are total pacifists. But for instance, there are portions of the Bible that say, I thank you, Lord, that you have made my hands able to war, which is not exactly the same thing as thou shalt not kill. So the way that I would, if I were in a Bible study, explore this idea is we would look at the 10 Commandments, we would look at the passage that I referred to from the Psalms, we would look at the Levitical laws about putting someone to death, we would look at New Testament passages that show perhaps at least a greater evidence of mercy. We would have to take a look at all of it and weigh it, these different portions of the book, to understand what the Bible has to say about killing. Um, and something that's important to acknowledge is that readers often disagree because there is usually not one universally accepted single meaning. And if this is true for the Bible or the Torah or the Quran, it is even more true for a book that is not holy, like a book like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which we're reading in this class. Um, More people will disagree, and that's acceptable in an English class because what we are required to do is to offer evidence of why we interpret the book the way we do. And this evidence really must centrally come from the book itself. We can include support from other people who perhaps have something to say about the interpretation of the book. Indeed, we are writing a document when we write an exegetical essay that explores possibly what the book means, and we are kind of in the same practice as the people who are writing about how to interpret the book. But ultimately, we have to find evidence from the book itself in order for it to be an exegetical reading, and your essays are to be exegetical. Here are some things that an exegetical essay about a non-holy book should do and should not do. Here are things that an essay for this class should do. They should make organized arguments about how to interpret the text that is its subject. Each paper should do that. It should make an organized argument about how to interpret the text that is its subject. That doesn't mean just summarize the plot. It means explain to us the overarching meaning that you see, and I give you questions that you respond to about meaning in your interpretation. And then, secondly, show evidence of the truth of the argument's claim by citing parts of the text. And you should cite these in MLA citation format in text citations. Such evidence should appear in each paragraph except possibly the first and last paragraphs. So it's not just enough to make an argument. You have to show your evidence really at close to each step. And you need to consider possible counterarguments against the paper's main point and then refute those arguments. In other words, think about why someone else might disagree with you and say why this is wrong. An example of that from the previous discussion of thou shalt not kill, if I were writing a paper on this, I might say, in my own interpretation, which is not absolute pacifism of thou shalt not kill. The Bible says thou shalt not kill in the Ten Commandments, and some have interpreted this to mean an absolute form of radical pacifism. I, however, see too many passages about warfare that God blesses throughout the Bible that allow me therefore to think that perhaps thou shalt not kill is not an absolute in every single circumstance commandment, as warfare, at least in certain kinds of circumstances, seems to be sanctioned by the book. And then at the very end, your paper should end with a summary conclusion that sums up the main points of the argument. Now, understand, I am going to be evaluating your paper on its ability to present evidence in support of its claims, and not precisely whether or not I agree with it, but I will expect you to consider counter arguments and the argument that you're making to have evidence. It is all right to disagree with me personally. Guessing my opinion on something or hearing me explicitly state it will not really help you write a good paper. It is possible to write a very bad paper where you agree with me 100% but offer no evidence, and it is possible for you to completely disagree with my opinion but offer fantastic evidence and get a fantastic grade. So I wanted you to understand that. But here are some things that your exegetical essay should definitely not do. It should not simply summarize the plot of the text. It's the difference between, say, me just retelling you the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. A more exegetical question to explore would be, why is it that Goldilocks feels entitled to go to the bear's house and judge their porridge and their beds? Why is she entitled, in at least her own mind, to decide what is just right? That would be a question to ask. No, don't just retell me the story. Examine what is going on in the book that you are reading or the text you are reading in more than just a blow by blow of the plot. It shouldn't offer a review of the text like, oh, I give it a thumbs up, everyone should read this, or oh, thumbs down, boo, hate this. No, that is fine for Yelp. It is not good for a college essay in an English class. Don't tell me, even though I would love to have this conversation with you independent of your essay, don't just tell me how a portion of the book made you feel. I could personally relate to this part of the book best is not interesting when you're trying to tell me what the book means. Tell me rather what the book means, not how you felt about what the book said. Offer someone else's analysis as the writer of the paper's own idea. It is fine to quote somebody. Matthew Arnold, in interpreting the Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, says the following: that is a very useful thing to quote and cite in support of something you yourself are saying, but you cannot say, oh, Matthew Arnold's ideas are totally my ideas. Yeah, I wrote that. By the way, I also wrote Moby Dick and Hamlet. That was me, totally me. All of this is a form of plagiarism. And don't fail to organize the paper in such a way that you have a summary conclusion. Some students think because I have a minimum length for the paper that all you have to do is just write to the end of that last page and you're done. That's not how it works. You have to finish your thought. You have to finish your argument with a summary of your main point. And here is a model I'm going to give you of how one might do writing in an exegetical essay. You are not required to know this for the midterm or the final exam, or indeed to use it for your paper for either one of the essays for this class. But I've included an incredibly short poem that is rich with meaning and relatively easy to understand at a face value. This poem is called The Eagle. It's by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I've put a copy up on Moodle. You won't need to include it in any of your other work in the class, but if you're reading this PowerPoint presentation with me giving you notes, it may be helpful to just look at the document independent of all the things that I'm saying here. It's a very short poem. And this is the paper that I'm imagining I would intend to write about. This is The Eagle by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'm just going to read it to you. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Obviously, this poem at some basic level is clearly about an eagle. It is discussing an eagle, a familiar bird of prey. But because of the larger project of the work of Alfred Lord Tennyson, I am asking if it might also be about the colonial power of the British Empire, something he was in favor of. And this is evident throughout his life and his work. So I am going to argue for this interpretation in my paper. This will be the nature of my argument. And so I'm going to write a paragraph to begin with that makes that argument at the end of the opening. And so here is that first paragraph. I will introduce this idea in the context of Tennyson's larger body of work, but the thesis statement is going to be my last sentence here. Pay attention to my last sentence here most particularly. It may be that I have additional sentences in this first paragraph, but this is what I'm going to say. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, was elevated to the peerage because of his close ties to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, her husband. Throughout his career, he wrote works that celebrated the military and cultural power of the British Empire. The poem The Eagle by Tennyson might appear at first glance just to be a poem about a bird, but examined in light of the poet's other works, it is also a statement about British colonial and military power. That last sentence, I'll repeat it. The poem The Eagle by Tennyson might appear at first glance just to be a poem about a bird, but examined in light of the poet's other works, it is also a statement about British colonial and military power. That's my thesis. That's my argument for the whole paper. So, my thesis is declared. What do I do now? What's my next step? I need to organize an argument, and I cannot stress this enough. It's really helpful to have an outline for anything you write that finds evidence of what I am saying is true in the body of the text of the poem. In other words, it's not just me deciding this, it's that I'm seeing it in the poem, and I'm going to show the evidence I found from the poem. And so the next thing I need to do is I need to go through this short poem line by line, searching for that evidence. If I were writing on a different kind of work, I would go through it carefully, looking for the evidence I need. And then I need to write it in a logical argument that persuades the reader. So here are, one by one, some pieces of evidence I find in the poem. I've highlighted them in red, and I'll explain each one by one. In the first line, this idea of clasping the crag, it might be like a colonial stronghold I'm suggesting. Clearly, the talons of a bird are evoked by these beautiful alliterative phrases, clasping the crag with crooked hands. Nevertheless, a colony, especially perhaps at first, is based on military muscle and the taking over of a space. We see the bird doing that here. This is a bird that is literally holding his own. He is holding the crag. Crags are rocks. They're not branches. So the fact that he is holding onto a rock as if it were his perch is interesting. Close to the sun in lonely lands. Here's how I interpret in lonely lands. Why would an eagle be in lonely lands? Isn't he more like a colonizer here than an eagle who might have other eagle friends or at least some baby eaglets? It is strange to think of the eagle as purely lonely in these lands. The lands would surely be his natural habitat, so why lonely? I suggest that in Tennyson's work, this is a sign of the colonizer feeling away from home, alienated even as he conquers. And then this phrase is particularly instrumental, I find. Ringed, meaning surrounded by, the azure means blue, world he stands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The whole line might be said of the British Empire, about which it is said that the sun never sets. It's like the British Empire has taken over the whole world and stands in the middle supreme. Admittedly, an eagle could appear majestic just standing on the edge of a cliff. It could be literally that, but I'm suggesting that we might interpret it as a colonial statement, a pro-colonial statement. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. First of all, the idea that the sea is wrinkled is pretty cool. It's just a beautiful, evocative image, I find. And the idea that it's crawling beneath him is an interesting idea. And so I say this is clearly a turn in the poem to a slightly different subject. And I wonder if this isn't a statement about the British Navy, which during Tennyson's time was known as the mightiest naval force in the whole world, bar none. It really did have that reputation. And you could say of the British Navy that the sea beneath it crawled. In other words, it was subordinate to the Navy itself. He watches from a mountain wall, his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. And so I wonder if the eagle's fall from the thunderbolt might be like a military strike by the British Empire against his enemies. I can particularly say that because Tennyson actually writes some poems about military operations from time to time and talks about them in celebration of their power. Even in defeat, he finds power. So it's not outside of the realm of what he would normally talk about. And while an eagle diving to catch, say, a rat in the underbrush, surely is doing something. If we think about a jet fighter coming down to strafe, now that's anachronistic for Tennyson, who did not live to see jet fighters. Nevertheless, the idea of a military strike is present in the visual imagery he presents us with in his discussion of the eagle's flight. And then, given all that's in this interpretation of this very short poem, might I not argue that the eagle stands as an allegorical figure for the power of the British Empire? The allegorical figure means a figure who stands in for an abstract concept. We have one in New York Harbor that you're familiar with. And we have the allegorical figure of the Statue of Liberty. Liberty is not something that we can see in a concrete thing. It's not like, oh my goodness, what's that in the corner? Oh, that's some liberty someone left over there. We don't say that. We can't see liberty, but we can have a figure like Lady Liberty or blindfolded Lady Justice on the courthouse who is set there to represent the concepts abstractly of liberty and of justice. But I suggest that one way to interpret this poem would be to see the eagle, even though the eagle is not the heraldic bird of the British Empire per se, it's nevertheless possible that in this poem, Tennyson is using the eagle to represent allegorically the idea, the abstract idea of a British Empire and its majesty over the world. So the observations I just made almost follow the structure of a good outline for a short paper. I went through it line by line, and look what I found. I found I could write something like 6 paragraphs. I probably want to add, if this exegetical paper requires research, a paragraph that discusses other works by Tennyson and what literary critics say about him. I would include that probably in a paragraph before I dove into the poem. That would be my own choice. Another writer could choose it to put it in another place, but it might belong there because it's part of my claim is that he talks about overt support for the British Empire in multiple works. And I'm also going to need an introductory paragraph and a summary conclusion. The introductory paragraph I showed you part of, and the summary conclusion will restate all my main points in my paper and will restate my thesis in a new language. I'll paraphrase it. So first would be the introduction. Then would be that paragraph about Tennyson's overt support of the British Empire, and it might include discussions of other literary critics about what it was that he felt about the British Empire. And then I would have at the end a conclusion. And this really is largely my outline for this paper. I have completed successfully that task. So the rough outline would look like this. I've just had, it looks like I've got approximately 9 paragraphs. Probably not all of these paragraphs are particularly long. This is plenty to say for the kind of paper that I'm likely to assign for you. I could easily do this and have this for another class. I could expand it if I needed to write a longer paper with additional information. But, and again, note that most of these paragraphs would be rather short, perhaps 4 or 5 sentences long. We're not talking about a giant paragraph. Each of the body paragraphs, meaning between the introduction and the conclusion, will have what might be called a quotation sandwich in it. Remember, I said point by point, you should offer evidence from the text in an exegetical. Here is what a quotation sandwich paragraph might look like. The topic sentence for the paragraph stating the point of argument about the text interpretation related to my thesis, but a lesser point of my argument defending it. Next sentence, it would be the introduction of a quotation in the work. I would explain the context of the quotation just a little bit. If I'm going to do even the slightest bit of summarizing, I would really only do it in this sentence. And then I would have the quotation and I would cite it in MLA. And then I will curate that quotation. What does the quotation mean? How should one read it in light of my argument? It's not enough for me to just throw the quote in there. I have to be able to tell you why you should understand that quote in light of my thesis. How does this information help prove my argument? And then a sentence that explains how the information in this paragraph overall helps prove the thesis. Of exactly what I'm talking about using this model. This is an example of what would have been paragraph 5 in my outline. Readers find in Tennyson's text a sense that the eagle's loneliness is part of its domination of the landscape, not unlike a colonizer might feel lonely. In the third line of the poem, Tennyson expresses this geographically. And then I have a colon, and you can see I start quoting. I've explained where this comes from. Ringed with the azure world he stands. And then I'm imagining a page number, Tennyson 324. Surrounded by azure, I'm now curating, explaining what this means. Or blue, it's as if the eagle is an island unto himself. Or rather, he dominates, it should say, excuse me, a landscape alone. One might almost accept this as a metaphor for the colonization of a place like Australia, where he represents the British Empire. He stands alone, surrounded by the ocean. He's the only force there, is what I'm getting at. And this, you see, is not a very long paragraph. It's just a few sentences, but each sentence helps prove my argument. And I apologize for the typo. I would correct this after my rough draft. So when I read the literature, I clearly have to look for clues for a coherent interpretation. And when I write, I need to present an organized argument with each paragraph presenting a point of my argument with evidence, much as Sherlock, another literary figure from the Victorian era, needs to find evidence in order to prove his argument that Moriarty committed the crime of the mystery he is trying to solve. So you're trying to solve the mystery of what does this mean? My concluding paragraph should be a summary of all the main points of my argument with a restatement of my thesis. And I would, as I compose the last paragraph, I should look at my outline or flip through my paper, either one, and notice what all the main points of my argument are. And then think at the end how I might say my thesis in another way. It's not that I would repeat it word for word, but I would say the same thing in a slightly different way. And the very last page should have a works cited page. And it's one of the core responsibilities of any academic writer It's to indicate where he or she has obtained the information cited in a paper. Make very certain you do this. In English, all works cited pages must be in MLA format. And this largely are the rules of writing for this class. I believe you can understand them. Email me if you have additional questions.